it's Alice. Welcome back to another GRE video. Today we're going to be talking about examples for essays. Oh my goodness. So this can be one of the hugest pains of the entire test, believe me, but there are ways that you can improve the way that you do this. So before we get into it, I am offering private tutoring that you can try out with a free 25-minute session with me. Check the link in the pinned comment to sign up for that. Now, back to the examples. We're going to be talking about how to come up with them, how to make them the best for your point, and the fact that you actually do not need examples, but examples can very, very much strengthen your argument, and therefore I would highly, highly recommend that you use at least one. Now, we're going to start off with how you can more easily come up with examples. Honestly, there is not a whole trick to this, but it is the first step in using examples. And if you've already come up with them, I would actually recommend this video over here that talks about how to use examples in your writing and how to make sure that they actually make that strong impact that you want them to. Other than that, examples are really used for the analyze and issue essay. The reason for this is because the analyze and argument essay already contains their own details, its own logic, its own reasoning, and you're really talking about why that logic and reasoning is incorrect. Whereas in the issue essay, you're actually trying to make the argument yourself. So you really want to then draw on those examples and try to convince your reader to stand on your side. A lot of the topics for the issue essays typically talk about things like politics, history, culture, identity, universities, education, and similar topics. Now, what you can really think about here is that it really helps if you read a lot more. So this can be anything, honestly. It can be books, biographies, nonfiction, fiction, any type of books, including comics and manga. It can include reading a lot of news, staying current with current events, getting in touch with personal stories, either your personal stories or the personal stories of other people. All types of things that you learned in school, particularly history, and other things from pop culture like movies, like television, or anything that can be used as an example. Even if it's fictional from a book or a movie or a TV series, you can still use that. As a side note, I can also say you can make up your examples, but a lot of people don't necessarily have the creativity to do that. It really helps if you have an idea and then you build off of that. And if you don't have exactly the right details or your example illustrates your point a little bit but not exactly, you can always tweak your example a little bit or fill in some of those details if you don't know them for the purposes of the issue essay. If you are about to take your GRE and you don't have time to sort of do a lot of that soul searching, a lot of that reading and watching and all of those things, definitely continue watching because I have a point for you later. What you want to think about is that actually coming up with examples and coming up with good examples is a skill. It's about reading questions and making sure you know how to relate them. So when you're talking about a specific question, for example, if you're talking about education, you can think about your education, somebody else's education, how your country does education, how your teachers viewed your education and how they treated you, and a lot of different scales like that. When you think about examples or when you read, for example, you can also come up with a few sort of flexible or key examples that can fit into a variety of questions. So this really helps if you're talking about a celebrity and you really understand different aspects of their lives. Not only did they just make a bunch of music, but they also did this, their education was this, they were an advocate for an NGO or the UN or something like that, those can really work. So a lot of these ideas are going to be sort of broad experiences. So you can talk about current events such as wars, such as COVID or the quarantine that's happening right now. Or you can talk about things like your own travels, somebody else's travels, your experience in school, etc., etc. It typically really helps if you go through some of the list of possible questions from the ETS website, which I will link in the description down below, that has the full list of analyze and issue questions so that you can practice fitting in some of those examples into multiple types of questions. Now, another thing is I mentioned before that coming up with good examples and brainstorming is actually a skill. So what you want to do is sit down and actually try to come up with examples for a single question, or you can take one idea and try to tie it into a variety of different questions. So both of these examples are really good, and whichever technique is better for you really depends on what type of thinker or what type of person you are. If you're somebody who likes to read and learn and know a lot, then trying to brainstorm for a single question can be super useful. If you're somebody who doesn't have a lot of interests, but you have a lot of very deep experiences, you can try and see if you can fit one idea into multiple different questions. So this is some sort of association and brainstorming practice that really gets your muscles going. You can even do this as a sort of brainstorming or outlining technique when you're practicing essay writing, and you can either actually write those essays afterwards or just make sure that you know what that brainstorming process is. In general, keep in mind that one example is typically pretty good. At the most, you can have probably 3 examples if they are really fitting and very much tied to what you're talking about. Otherwise, your essay just becomes a list of examples and it doesn't have enough logic or reasoning to support all of those. Now, if you're going the take an idea and put it into a bunch of different questions route, you definitely want at least 2 or 3 good examples that you can branch out into different types of questions, just so that in case one question comes up and you really can't fit your example into it, then you have a few examples to fall back on. Now, to give you an idea of both techniques, I really want to actually give you an example. So the first thing that we're going to do is try the one example technique that will fit a multitude of different questions. So one of my favorite books is the biography by Walter Isaacson about Steve Jobs and his life. So one of the really key events that happened in his life was after he founded Apple way back in the day and way before Apple became the company that we know now, he was actually voted out of his role as founder and as managing partner there. Now, this is a very interesting example because obviously I read the entire book about Steve Jobs' life, but a specific example, a specific event that happened. Now, a few of the questions that it could fall into are, number 1, the well-being of a society is enhanced when many of its people question authority. So with this example, we can talk about the entire board of directors of Apple back in the day questioning the people in authority, which was Steve Jobs in his CEO or in his head honcho role. Of course, that is a very micro example, but in general, it can illustrate that example pretty well. Number 2, we have a claim and reason question. The claim is, in any field, business, politics, education, government, those in power should step down after 5 years. The reason? The surest path to success for any enterprise is revitalization through new leadership. So again, this one fits more directly when we're talking about business, for example. So back in the day, Steve Jobs was the head of Apple, and after not about 5 years, but after a while, he was asked to step down because the board of directors was worried about revitalization through new leadership. And then after a while, he was then again brought back and then made Apple into the company that it is today. You can see how that example can kind of line up with somebody saying that yes, those in power should step down after 5 years. Or you could even say that after Steve Jobs came back, he had been on the top of the list for years and years until his death. We also have this question. Formal education tends to restrain our minds and spirits rather than set them free. This is pretty broad, and you can see that it's not exactly about being voted out as the founder of Apple. But for Steve Jobs' life, he has a very, very famous commencement speech, I believe it was at Stanford, where he talks about not being able to connect the dots until you're very far into the future. What he was talking about in part was that he once took this typography class that eventually became the font that we use all the time, and that was made popular through Apple. And you can say that a lot of the classes that he took, for example, played a role that wasn't exactly clear while he was taking them, but rather turned out to be pretty useful after the fact. We also have number 4 here. The greatness of individuals can be decided only by those who live after them, not by their contemporaries. So this one is also very interesting because, of course, Steve Jobs died not too long ago, but you can definitely think about how Steve Jobs, for example, was viewed back in the day while he was still alive when he came out with the iPod and then the iPhone and Macs, for example, whereas the company now and his image now, after 10, almost 15 years at this point, you can sort of draw a contrast between those two things. I also have number 5, which is that universities should require every student to take a variety of courses outside the student's field of study. So this one is a lot like claim number 3, which is about formal education or about the variety of courses or about university education and things like that. So you can kind of understand how reading a single book about Steve Jobs' life allows me to answer a huge variety of these questions. Now, we can also have a second example, which is, I think, a very flexible example as well, and maybe something that you might be more familiar with. So this one, of course, is going to be about COVID or coronavirus and the pandemic. If this is a triggering topic for you, I'll put the timestamp here so you know where to go in case you don't want to talk about it. But a few of the prompts that can be answered by this are, number 1, governments should focus on solving the immediate problems of today rather than on trying to solve the anticipated problems of the future. This can kind of be taken 2 ways when you're talking about COVID. The first one is that, right now, as COVID is going on, we want to solve the immediate problems rather than look into the future. Or you can talk about before COVID happened, when we're talking about what those immediate problems were, and you can say that present time when COVID is happening is the quote-unquote future. So you can kind of take opposite sides with that. We also have number 2, which is Governments should place few, if any, restrictions on scientific research and development. So obviously the most poignant example of this is going to be the COVID vaccine. So you can think about what kind of scientific research and development was done here, particularly, let's say, with testing on subjects and how quickly the development happened. So you could take either stance for this question. We also have number 3. The surest indicator of a great nation is represented not by the achievement of its rulers, artists, or scientists, but by the general welfare of its people. So me living in the United States and seeing how COVID has impacted Americans, you can really see how you can answer this question. Of course, this is a slight tangent to COVID itself, but certainly you can think about the people who developed the COVID vaccine versus all of the people who are left jobless, who are left homeless, or have had to really make incredible changes to their lives because of how COVID has impacted them. We can also see the next sentence, which is, as we acquire more knowledge, things do not become more comprehensible, but more complex and mysterious. So this can also be taken 2 ways, particularly when COVID was still happening back in December, in January, February, March of 2020. We were quickly determining all of these different characteristics about it, figuring out what we need to know, what we don't need to know, trying to develop a vaccine and trying to figure out how people can be safe but also still earn a living, blah, blah, blah. And the more that we knew about it, the more difficult you can say from the scientific perspective, the more we realized we didn't know about it. Or from a, more social perspective, you can say we actually then figured out how to quarantine, how to make people wear masks, how to figure out essential workers, blah, blah, blah. And the last prompt that I will say COVID falls into is this one. In any situation, progress requires discussion among people who have contrasting points of view. Now, this one seems relatively a reach, but you can think about how COVID in the United States, for example, has impacted politics. Right now, after Christmas of December 2020, the United States Congress is talking about whether or not people should be getting direct benefits or to be getting payments to help them with rent payments, to help them with food and other expenses. Now, you can either say that it is a good thing or it is a bad thing that people who have contrasting viewpoints are really having to talk to each other and work with each other, using COVID as an example. But of course, this really works with our government in general. Hopefully that is helpful. I know this video is quite long, so I will rush through the next one. So this is the opposite brainstorming strategy, which is more traditional. And this is where you have one prompt and you try to come up with a variety of examples for it. So the prompt is, if a goal is worthy, then any means taken to attain it are justifiable. So, of course, as you read this, you will probably think that this typically talks about negative means, so harming others in some way. But technically, the fact that any means contains harming others is an assumption that you want to talk about. And probably most people would say you mostly agree unless it harms other people. So if you're talking about this, for example, you can have a personal example. Let's say you're somebody who grew up very poor, you had to work 60 hours a week, or you had to work full-time to get yourself through undergrad, or to otherwise put yourself in school. You overcame anxiety and depression to get educated. You had to figure out how to be a single parent for a while, etc., etc. So any means. You can also have a historical example. So a good one is thinking about Mao Zedong with the Great Leap Forward back in the mid-1900s, where he helped China ship food out even though Chinese farmers were starving, because he wanted China to have a really good reputation abroad. Or you can think about, for example, the CIA intervening in Latin and South America for a variety of military interventions and all of these different times to prevent socialism from spreading. And one good example of this is helping stage a military coup in 1973 in Chile. And that afterwards led to a whole bunch of political oppression and democide, which means the government killing its citizens and committing genocide of actual Chileans themselves. There are also a lot of different similar examples from history that you could draw on for that. You can also point to a sort of social example. So this is something that is sort of in the collective minds of people. So there's a classic story of a parent who steals bread so that their child doesn't have to be hungry. In general, this is viewed as acceptable or ethical. From your point of view, depending on whether you say any means is justifiable or not, it can be a really good example to use. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how you can come up with different examples and how you might be able to use them to answer a variety of questions. Now, obviously, I haven't gone over every example or every type of question, but if you'd like to see more of this type of content, let me know in the comments down below so I can make more of these videos for you. I know it's been a long video, so thank you so much for sticking with me, for watching. I hope this was really helpful for you. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I also, again, am offering private tutoring, so get in contact with me, and I will see you again next time. Bye!